Coming at number 5, we've got Gonjiam Asylum. Like many famously haunted places, this one is scary and well known enough to spawn a feature film, and a pretty darn good one too. Like legitimately scary with plenty of twists and a wicked premise. But beyond the scary flick, which is a whole lot of movie magic and quality pacing, we've got an actual ghost story to look at. Many believe this asylum to be one of the most haunted locations in South Korea, and it attracts all sorts of thrill seekers. Let's just hope their stories end up a little better than those in the movie, right? No guarantees. The tales surrounding this abandoned hospital are varied and plentiful, painting many a vivid picture of doom and terror. Most of the time, they don't really line up with each other either. This hasn't stopped rumors from proliferating though. If anything, the huge spread of stories and legends have increased Gonjiam's notoriety. The most common thing to hear about is that its patients started dying mysterious deaths one day, and the number of fatalities rose quite quickly. Nobody could explain why this was the case unless they were paranormal deaths. Terrible treatment and tragic deaths leading to the creation of ghosts, phantoms, and demons. The imbuing of a dark, evil energy at the place where so many had lost their minds and lives. As time went on, more stories escaped the facility, including the owner of the asylum being a murderous psychopath himself. He would keep people there against their will, regardless of whether their treatment was working or not. From time to time, this owner would kill a patient just for fun while keeping the others to be tortured. Only those who made daring escapes would survive to tell this story. Then there were whispers of doctors becoming just as unhinged as their patients, performing dangerous experiments and doing horrible things to those in their care. The more things became unhinged, the more cursed energy seemed to collect in the building. Now, if we're being honest, the real reason the asylum shut down has nothing to do with these activities, although a sewage problem could be a convenient cover-up for all the insanity behind closed doors.
Moving on to number 4, Beechworth Lunatic Asylum. Beechworth is located in Australia and was operational for 128 years before it was closed in 1995. Now, according to the stories, over 9,000 patients had died while being treated there, and those who visit it today claim to see faces floating in the building's windows. Its structure was interesting. They used a variation of wall structure called the ha-ha wall to keep patients inside the courtyard. These walls consisted of a trench dipping down towards the wall so that it presented a taller looking wall to prevent anyone from trying to escape by climbing, all while looking like a regular wall on the outside, so the asylum did not give off the impression of a prison. Getting out legally was even more difficult though. Patients who only required 2 signatures to enter required 8 signatures on their paperwork in order to be discharged. It's also said that the man who used to transport the dead bodies out of the asylum killed himself there, and that his ghost, along with a woman who was thrown out of a window, still linger on the grounds. Moving on to 3, the Pennhurst Asylum. The Pennhurst Asylum is one of the most famous asylums in the world. Located in Pennsylvania, it was initially known as the Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic, and it was closed in 1987 after a slew of controversy. In 1968, it was revealed in a 5-part news report that the conditions at the patients, who were both physically and mentally disabled, were anything but up to standard. And later in 1983, 9 employees who worked there were indicted on a series of charges that included beating patients, some of which were in wheelchairs, and arranging for patients to fight and assault one another. The stories of neglect, abuse, and alleged murders have spawned many a tale about the building being haunted. The truth behind many of these stories or other heinous acts may never be known either. The institution was first commissioned in 1903. After its closure, many of the patients' belongings were left abandoned inside the building, and tourists have often claimed to hear spooky things on the asylum's grounds. There's even an alleged audio recording of voices shouting, "I'll kill you, go away, and why won't you leave?" along with reports of objects moving around the building and visitors being pushed while there. And at number 2, Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. The Trenton Psychiatric Hospital has a dark history, and it was the first public medical hospital in the state of New Jersey, opening in 1848. One of the staff members, Dr. Henry Cotton, the medical director, believed that infections were related to mental ailments. His theory, based on medical discoveries concerning the creation of syphilis, was that mental illness was caused by bodily infections, so one had to remove the infected areas in order to cure the mental illness. He and his staff removed various body parts from patients that they believed may have become infected, which actually led to hundreds of fatalities and mutilations. This includes stomachs, ovaries, testicles, gallbladders, you name it. Often he would carry on with these removals despite not having patients or their families' consent. While he left the hospital in 1930 and died 3 years later, many of his practices, including the removal of patients' teeth, were continued until 1960. These days, parts of the hospital are still in use, but other areas have been abandoned, and they're terrifying to look at. And finally, in at number 1, Danvers Lunatic Asylum. Danvers, located in Massachusetts, operated not only as an asylum, but also as a prison. Opening in 1878, it was used for mentally unstable criminals, and was known to be incredibly understaffed. By the 1930s, it was reported that patients would often be found dead days later after passing, and that procedures the likes of lobotomies and shock therapy were the norm there. Patients were restrained by straitjackets, and heavy drug use was utilized to keep patients at bay. This caused huge controversy back in the 60s, which eventually led to major budget cuts. To add insult to injury, the location of the Danvers Asylum was also where the Salem village of the Salem witch trials occurred. So yeah, double whammy there. It's also been an inspiration to many fictional asylums, including DC's Arkham Asylum and H.P. Lovecraft's Arkham Sanatorium. It was even the location of the horror film Session 9.
Number 5 on this list is the Beechworth Lunatic Asylum. Located in Australia, this is one of the most haunted asylums in the entire world. Thrillist says, formerly the Mayday Hills Lunatic Asylum, now La Trobe University's scenic Beechworth campus, this place saw 128 years of terror before closing in 1995. Apparently 9,000 patients died here over the years, and people were so fast and loose with the term lunatic that few patients ever left the premises alive. It comes as no surprise that a few people lingered after death. Faces floating in windows are a common sight, along with Matron Sharp doing her rounds and children laughing. Tommy Kennedy, who used to transport the dead out of the asylum and died there himself, still hangs around. There's also a woman who was thrown out of a window and died in front of the hospital because she was Jewish and the only person allowed to move her, a rabbi, couldn't make it to Beechworth sooner. Yeah, so clearly this place has seen its fair share of trauma throughout the years, folks. 9,000 people is a lot of people who have died. Like, we're talking about a small town's worth of human beings who died at this freaking asylum. And as exampled by that poor Jewish woman, these deaths weren't all from natural causes either. There was said to be some sick workers here, people who were twisted and got off on hurting others, people who worked at the asylum but probably would have been better suited to be in it themselves. Asylums in general are already susceptible to haunting considering what's going on, but when you have this amount of death and atrocities take place, it just makes it that much easier for ghosts and paranormal entities to cling on. Many of the locals don't even come close to this place anymore, and a lot of the tourists who do go here thoroughly regret that decision soon afterwards. These entities are angry and want to punish those who are living for what happened way back then. I don't recommend being one of the people who gets punished.
Coming in number 4, we've got the Rolling Hills Asylum. Sounds really pleasant and picturesque, right? Rolling hills evoke an image of calm, breezy stretches of road, some tall grass blowing in the wind, yeah? Well, that might be how they sold this asylum to prospective patients and their families, but the reality of life here is far from the pastoral charm implied by the name. And it didn't really start in an asylum either. It was more of a place for all sorts of unsavory characters to be collected to ensure they didn't cause any problems for more upstanding members of society. Definitely not a way for the rich to put all the people they didn't want to think about in one convenient location away. Of course, when you put all sorts of poor, sick, and mentally ill people in a cramped place and just sort of leave them there, things don't improve at a great speed. The opposite, if you can believe it. There were almost 2,000 recorded deaths here, but that does seem to be a bit of an underestimate. As is the case with plenty of spots like this, all sorts of undocumented deaths did occur, and it's said that there are hundreds of unmarked and unaccounted for graves on the site. The result of all this death, overcrowding, and lunacy is a legacy of ghosts and demons. Rolling Hills is well known for paranormal activity these days and attracts a fair deal of enthusiasts quite often. In fact, there are all sorts of ghost tours offered to those who don't think sneaking into a haunted asylum is a good idea. People have reported hearing blood-curdling screams throughout the location and have seen doors slam without anyone around to do so. There's also the famed Shadow Hallway, a stretch of corridor that is said to host a whole squad of shadowy apparitions. Walking down this hall, you might see a figure peeking out from around the corner, or maybe you'll witness a looming presence gliding along, looking for something it'll never find. And who could forget dear Roy Krause, the tallest ghost most folks have ever seen? He lived his life as a 7'5" phenom, and now his phantom stands just as tall. Coming in number 3, we've got Allegheny. Overcrowding seems to be a universal problem when it comes to places meant for society's undesirables. We'll happily build a place to hide away folks who don't fit the mold, but then we decide there are more odd folks than ever and don't accommodate. It's a problem with prisons now, and was a problem with mental asylums back in the day. Allegheny is a particularly well-known haunted asylum for a multitude of reasons. This enormous building made out of hand-cut stone is something straight out of a nightmare. Urban explorers salivate at the thought of exploring a location like this, and for good reason. The asylum was built to house about 250 people. How many ended up crammed into the location though? Take a wild guess, go ahead. Are you locked in your answer? good. They ended up funneling over 2,400 people here, over 10 times capacity. You can imagine how this went and what might have happened to those living in this overstuffed hellhole. And it wasn't just the overcrowding that caused problems. The staff here did all sorts of heinous things to the many folks stuck inside, often getting away with it because of the general namelessness of things in a 10 times capacity asylum. Ice pick lobotomies, rusty cages and chains, you name it. The result was despicable, and years later we still see ghosts. Coming at number 2, we've got the Danvers Lunatic Asylum. This one straight up looks like a haunted castle, which is a great start. The death, debauchery, and general disdain for human life and sanctity almost guarantees that it remains haunted too. Like most asylums, before the idea of mental health was really dreamt up, Danvers was a place of blood and brutality, abuse and archaic treatments, chaos and crisis. It opened with the intention of housing and treating mentally unstable criminals. Treatments back in the day were less than effective though. Shock therapy and lobotomies were the favorites of doctors here, which, surprise surprise, just hurt the criminals more. And after a while, it was decided that Danvers wouldn't just be a place for mentally unstable criminals. They'd toss anyone in there. This saw an influx of mentally stable felons, alcoholics, and handicapped folks, all to be treated the same as the folks who were there first. Uh-oh. Nobody seemed to alter their methods to account for these new patients and inmates though, and the result was horrid. Eventually, the staff couldn't keep up with all the new people, and many people died. Some bodies were left to rot for extended periods of time because people passed away and nobody was looking for them. This, of course, led to all sorts of myths and legends about mysterious ghosts and spirits. Coming in at number 1, we've got Narin. Also known as the Fool's Tower, this cylindrical building in Vienna was once the earliest mental asylum in Europe. Here they kept all sorts of folks deemed unfit for public life, and doctors performed a plethora of experiments upon them. Over time, this use would be phased out and a new, interesting, and morbid purpose would be found. It now houses the Pathological Anatomical Museum. Educational and terrifying. See, the contents of this museum are gruesome to say the least. They have a wide variety of physical abnormalities preserved in containers of formaldehyde. So if you ever wanted to see an abnormality hacked off a human and put into a jar like some sort of mad scientist hidden cellar, this is the place. They've also got a collection of replicas of body parts made out of wax. Doesn't sound like a horror movie in the making. So from an asylum to a place displaying the most wild and weird ways the human body can become deformed, we've got it all at Narin. Not for the faint of heart or weak of stomach. I can hear the scratch of pen on paper as folks update their bucket lists already. These are definitely visitable, but who would want to see all this, right? Ghosts, body parts, and human suffering.
Starting us off at number 5, the Metropolitan State Hospital. Located in Norwalk, California, this hospital has roots back to 1915, when the Californian governor at the time allowed for the purchase of land to build a state hospital, specifically designed to care for individuals who had psychiatric disabilities, which, at the time, was on the rise. When it first came to be, it was self-sufficient. It had its own farm and gardens, which kept costs at a minimum. It wasn't until after World War II, though, that the hospital's methods began to take a turn for the worse. New therapies and psychotropic medications were being used, and many of its former patients claimed that the way that the hospital operated on was similar to a prison. While many of the stories about the hospital have not been confirmed, there are a few tales that have resonated with the public about it, particularly the one known as the Hospital of Seven Teeth. In 1978, a patient was said to have gone for a walk on the grounds but never returned, having been murdered by a fellow patient named Melvin Wilson, who confessed to the police in 1980. He had dismembered her body and placed it in 3 separate graves, and kept her teeth as souvenirs. Now, the hospital itself was closed in 1992, with most of the building demolished by 2009, minus the hospital's administration building.
Number 4 on this list is the Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital. If you had a mental illness, then I promise you this is not where you wanted to end up. Thrillist says, believed to be one of the most haunted spots in South Korea, this abandoned psych hospital could be the basis for the next Stephen King novel based on its checkered history. According to local lore, patients here began dying mysterious deaths one after the other, forcing the facility to shut down. Many believe the murderous owners of the place was to blame, claiming that he kept patients as hostages, only to flee to the States when families of the deceased demanded explanations. There are also rumors of doctors going insane, rivaling their patients in madness. So literally folks, if you ended up here, then there was a pretty good chance that not only did you not get the help that you needed, but you also just died. Whether this was because of the sick owners or the doctors, who even knows? That much death has left behind its mark though, and now this place looks like a safe haven for ghosts and everything paranormal. There's also been talk of a creature that lurks here, a creature that was actually the cause of all this death to begin with and is lurking, waiting for somebody to stop by and take them next. If I was you, I wouldn't want to be that person. Number 3 on this list is the Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. This is a scary masterpiece, folks. Thrillist says, this impressive structure, allegedly the world's second largest hand-cut stone masonry building after the Kremlin, looks like it was designed as the set of a blockbuster thriller. Built around the Civil War era, the asylum was designed to house around 250 patients, but ended up holding more than 2,400, including for a brief period, the infamous Charles Manson. That's the opposite of a celebrity endorsement. Along with severe overcrowding, profound abuse abounded. People were locked in cages, lobotomized with ice picks, chained to things, and the combination led to hundreds of deaths and a palpable air of suffering. Apparitions are aplenty, like the still deranged patient Ruth, who likes to attack visitors. And since the asylum was also briefly a Civil War military base, uniformed soldier ghosts roam the halls. Thousands have claimed to hear voices telling them to get out. Civil War themed ghost tours, tours of the medical center, forensic buildings and geriatrics buildings, and zombie events and balls fully play up the twisted history on the campus grounds. Now, don't get me wrong, would it be really fun to be part of a zombie event at this place? Yeah, absolutely. But I'm also not trying to get attacked by Ruth, the deranged ghost patient. Whenever people travel to a place like this, there is a risk involved. I personally am not willing to take the risk based on the history that this place has seen. Comment down below if you would. Number 2 on this list is Danvers Lunatic Asylum. This asylum hosted a very select group, criminals. Thrillist says, part prison, part asylum, all terror. This gothic monolith opened in 1878 to house mentally unstable criminals. Thanks to the addition of the mentally handicapped, alcoholics, and plain old felons, it became so severely understaffed by the 1930s that patients' deaths were often not discovered until days later, when they were found rotting in some forgotten corner. Shock therapy and lobotomies were standard procedures. In fact, some called Danvers the birthplace of the prefrontal lobotomy. But a large cemetery on site said to be haunted by evil spirits suggests these were not always successful. The sinister castle-like building is said to have inspired H.P. Lovecraft's Arkham Sanatorium, and so also Batman's Arkham Asylum, and was the setting of demon movie Session 9. And as if that weren't enough, Danvers used to be Salem Village. Yeah, of Salem witch trials fame. Regular ghosts are one thing, witch ghosts are another one altogether. Think about how few people would have had to work here, where a literal patient would die and wouldn't be discovered until days later. And also think about what that would have meant for the actual patients. That means that even if you were still alive, you probably wouldn't be treated or seen by a professional for days at a time. Which also means that you might not eat for days at a time either, and be stuck in what I can only assume would have been a cell by yourself for that entire time. This would have been a horrible place to go, even if it was just for criminals. Because of all of this, it is now deeply haunted and a place I highly recommend avoiding. And finally, number 1 on this list is the Waverly Hills Sanatorium. This is an asylum that I've talked about a few times on this channel before, which speaks to how haunted it actually is. Thrillist says, with an alleged 63,000 deaths taking place inside its walls, this place is up to its eyeballs in spirits, not surprisingly topping lists of America's most haunted spots. Originally built as a tuberculosis hospital in 1910, the building saw many die from the disease, but tales of mistreatment and dubious human experimentation trickled out, and patients left the premises in what was known as the death tunnel or body chute. Apparitions including Timmy, a boy who likes to play with rubber balls who's been caught on tape, the nurse who hanged herself in room 502, another nurse who fell from the same room's window, and scattered screams and footsteps have all been seen. 63,000 deaths. And here we were thinking that the 9,000 in the other place was bad, here's 63,000 more. Any place that has a death tunnel and a body chute, that should not be a place meant for rehabilitation and seeking help. We are talking about some sick stuff that went on here. I would get into some of the rumors associated with the human experimentation, but I honestly don't think that YouTube would let this video stay up if I did. There are a plethora of ghostly spirits that haunt this place now. Dark spirits that have lost all sense of humanity and are more demon than spirit. This is a spot that must be avoided at all costs.